HDR. It's everywhere. TVs, monitors, games, even your favorite Netflix shows. But if you tried using it, there's a good chance you hated how it looked. In this video, I'll break down what HDR really is, how it works, and why for most people, it actually makes things worse. So HDR, or High Dynamic Range, in simple terms, lets bright areas in a scene look brighter, dark areas to look darker, and colors to be more vivid. Think of it like drawing with 100 colors instead of 20. You get richer and a higher contrast image. But in practice, a lot of people get the opposite effect, and that usually comes down to the limitations of their TVs or monitors. Just because the screen supports HDR does not mean it will display it properly. Add in the fact that Windows HDR support has been rough for a while, and that many games implement HDR poorly, and you start seeing why results could vary so much. There are three main things you need to look out for, and number one is high brightness. You need at least 600 nits for an OLED, or closer to 1000 nits for an LCD to avoid a dull picture. Number two, deep blacks and good local dimming for LCDs. You need proper local dimming like full array local dimming or mini LED with lots of zones. Edge-lit panels will not cut it here. And if you do not know the difference between a edge-lit panel or a backlit one, I highly recommend you do a quick search and understand the major differences between these two, because it is absolutely critical to how a monitor or a TV creates or lights up an image. Number three is a wide color gamut. A good HDR panel should cover at least 90 to 95% of the DCI P3 color space. If you miss any one of these 3 points, turning on HDR will make things look worse. Moving over to the panel type, which actually has quite a big impact here as well. Let's start with IPS panels. They have great colors and good viewing angles, but weaker contrasts. VA panels have better contrast and deeper blacks than IPS, so they handle HDR a bit better in this case. And last but not least is OLED, which is basically HDR heaven. Thanks to the per pixel lighting, it's able to turn off each pixel on a black scene to achieve absolutely perfect blacks. But even then, there's some tech that's usually layered on top, like QLED, which is quantum dots on a VA panel, mini LEDs with lots of tiny LEDs for better local dimming, which is usually found on IPS panels, and QD OLED or quantum dot OLED, which is typically an upgraded version of an OLED, which is able to achieve even greater brightness and even better colors. So let's ask the real question. How much better is the experience on a proper HDR setup, and is it really worth the trouble and extra cost? The short answer is yes. It's almost game-changing. It adds an entirely new layer to your visuals, and I'd argue it's a significant upgrade if you play cinematic AAA titles. If you mostly play competitive esports games like Counter-Strike, Valorant, and League, you probably won't care as much, but even then, it actually does make a difference, so it's not entirely useless. To give you a live example, I'll be testing out a few games with HDR on versus HDR off, so we can compare the differences. All games will be running at 4K on an LG OLED, which means this is about as close to a proper HDR demonstration as you can get. Let's start with Spider-Man 2 on PC. I've set the world time to night because this makes the difference easier to spot. Pay attention to the bright highlights, like the windows in the center of the frame and the dark sky up top, especially where it fades into the edge of the screen. With HDR on, the darks are truly dark and the highlights pop out without looking overblown. Even though they kind of are, but that's because of the camera here. Turn HDR off and you can instantly see the difference. The dark areas are now lighter, highlights lose some detail, and the entire screen takes on a more uniform brightness. The contrast ratio drops significantly, and that's the theme that you'll notice in every example. Switching over to daytime, the sun and reflections look bright and natural with HDR on. Turn it off and the contrast drops again. The bright areas are over-highlighted, but the overall screen brightness is lower because it can't create the same separation between lights and darks. Next game is Wuchang Fallen Feathers. I picked up another high contrast scene with HDR on. The deep shadows along the edges fade perfectly into the darkness of the room, almost disappearing into pitch black. HDR off flattens everything once again, the shadows lift, the highlights dull, and the whole image loses impact. Finally is Forza Motorsport. With HDR enabled, the dark night sky is rich and deep, the lamppost lights are brightly lit, and the blue building in the background is properly vivid and well saturated. The car in white stands out clearly from the asphalt, and you can see a great amount of contrast there. Turn HDR off and the contrast completely collapses. The difference between highlights and shadows shrinks, colors lose their punch, and the overall brightness dips. These examples are all prime cases of HDR working as intended. When you have the right hardware and settings, it's not just a subtle upgrade, it's a major step up in visual quality. So here's the takeaway. HDR can be an absolute game changer, but only if you got the right setup, the right panel, enough brightness, deep blacks, wide color gamut, and proper calibration all have to come together for it to really shine. Once again, if any one of these pieces is missing, you're better off leaving HDR off and sticking to SDR. But when it's done right, it's one of those upgrades that's really hard to go back from. If you enjoyed this breakdown or learned something new, hit the like button, subscribe for more deep dives like this, and let me know in the comments which games do you think look the best in HDR. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.